Hey students, I hope you are all doing well. This is my first lecture on video lecture on fiction. Although I do think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today relates to almost all of everything that we're writing. Usually when I think of genres, I tend to think as of fiction as being a bit more character driven than the other genres. Although certainly it's absolutely essential in creative nonfiction and poetry to have a sense of character. To the extent that we are always writing about something as human, we're always exploring the problem of what it means to be human. We're always exploring issues of identity. What makes a person? How does a person grow? How does a person change? Can a person change? What are the effects of events on a particular person's growth and development in life? This is why we are continually fascinated by story, because it tells these narratives speak to the experiences that we have as people. And oftentimes when we think about narratives, they're based on these conceptions of how we live and stories that are told over and over again, and we live over and over again, that have to do with coming to realizations. We call that epiphany narrative, or journey narratives, which a hero must go through a set of challenges on his or her process, or their process towards self-realization. There are lots of different kinds of narratives. Today I wanted to talk about one essential inherent part of fiction that's also transferable um, uh, to other disciplines, and that is the issue of tension. If there is no tension, if there are no stakes, there is no art, really. And that's a tough thing to get your mind around sometimes, because you might go to an art gallery and you'll see a still life, which just looks like a bowl of fruit on a table, and you think there's no tension in that. That's art, but actually there is. You're just not aware enough of what the artist is trying to do, or the context that this is existing in, or the other modes of painting and genres that are being spoken to there that give it or grant it tension. That what you're looking at has something very important to say, and you just don't know enough about it yet to see anything there but a bowl of fruit. Fiction tends to give you a lot more information about what's important than a still life painting. Things happen in fiction, they move over time. There is both, there's a relationship between the time of the story and the plot of the story. That relationship is incredibly important. But right now, what I'm going to talk about is this issue of tension. So I'm going to share a little bit of a handout here with you. And one thing that I really want you thinking about as we move forward is this conception that Heather Sellers first introduced me to as a teacher and as a writer, of this equation that she calls desire plus danger equals tension. And that speaks right to the fundamentals of storytelling and story writing, that you need a character with a strong desire for something. That's the entire thrust of your story. Without a sense of what might be called motivation, then there's no movement, or there's no energy to a story. And without any apparent danger or consequences to that desire. And the danger can be manifest in many ways. It could be the consequences of achieving the desire, or the consequences of not achieving the desire. Or there might be something just inherent in the desire of self that's dangerous to the character. But that danger must be there in order for the desire actually to matter. Otherwise, the desire is, you have a very flat story. Character wants something, character gets what he or she wants. Everybody lives happily ever after isn't much of a story. And so there have to be, even if it has a happy ending, there has to be consequences even to happiness. And there have to be barriers and blockades and oppositions in the way of that in order for the story to have tension. The elements of tension, according to Sellers, are: you need a person with a problem, some sort of issue. That person must have desires, there must be stakes and consequences, and there must be obstacles to achieving those desires. She also talks a lot about modulating tension, which is, she talks about turning up and down the thermostat, or turning the temperature up and down, making things hotter or colder at different points in the narrative. In other words, we talk about rising action and climax as if a story has one point of tension in it, and really we're talking about the point of greatest tension and climax, but there are little climaxes, pardon the expression, all throughout a narrative. There are moments of great tension and consequence. In this piece that we're going to be looking at, which is a short film, we're going to take a look at a moment of really great tension and talk about how we get there and why it matters. Now, I will say, before you watch this, or I would hit the pause button if you've not watched 8, the short film that I'm going to be talking about in a minute, because that short film is much more enjoyable if you don't necessarily know everything about it because your professor told you about it. All right, so some pointers here. Without desire, a strong need or wish, danger is simply a plot device. Without consequences or opposition, desire or motive produces no energy. And as you're writing, if you've got a flat story, if you're not sure that your story has any kind of oomph or stakes to it, I want you to think about the following things. Here are some of the ways you can increase tension. Create oppositional forces. It doesn't have to be a villain. Like most sort of, not all, but quite a bit of bad storytelling has a very clear and uncomplicated villain. James Bond films, for example. I find them incredibly boring. When I was a kid, I used to love them. And now as an adult, they're just boring. And part of that is because the hero is unquestionably a hero. The villain is unquestionably a villain, off to do horrible things. Often there's a real little reason. And so all of the energy and action is just this guy, James Bond, who is not going to die, perpetually being put in dangerous situations. This is why you need a damsel in distress in almost every one of those James Bond movies, is because that person could actually die. And in the one really interesting film in the Bond series, Her Majesty's Secret Service, the one that has George Lazenby, an Australian, as James Bond, he actually loses, there's a consequence. He loses his love interest. Love interest dies as a consequence of his job and what he does. And that actually is moving and compelling in a way that none of the other films are. It is incredibly problematic because the woman is simply a plot device to create tension in the story. But at least there is some. And it is why it is maybe not the best acted or the best produced, but definitely one of the better scripts in the Bond franchise. But you need oppositions, and you need to complicate your sense of hero and villain. Think of protagonist and antagonist instead of hero and villain. By protagonist, we mean the one who wants, the character whose desire is driving the story. By antagonist, the antagonist would be the person who is in the way, who's the main source of opposition to those desires. Now, in a lot of literature, in fact, in all literature, even when there's a person who isn't a clear antagonist, the main antagonist in a work of literature, and in fiction in particular, is almost always the same person who is the protagonist. In other words, have you ever heard the phrase, "you are your own worst enemy"? The biggest danger to the protagonist is usually in some way him or herself. That whether it be their fears, their desires, their insecurities, their cowardliness, their bravery. These are the things that end up being the greatest threat. Their ignorance. These are the things that end up being the thing that is constantly in their way. And in order to self-realize, they have to clear these things out. So in some ways, one can think of an antagonist as sort of a projection of the inner failings of the protagonist onto another human being. Think about gradually increasing the stakes at key points in the narrative. So something that the character wants, they might realize halfway through the narrative might come at a cost to someone that they care about, or that they might get a sense that the costs are much greater than they initially thought. And certainly we learn this, we all learn this in our lives, that there are things we want, and oftentimes the consequences just aren't worth it. You know, any VH1 Where Are They Now episode about a rock band can show you how you can get exactly what you want and have it destroy you. Make the desire of the protagonist essential to the character's sense of self. It really needs to be important to who the character is as a person, that this desire fundamentally shapes who they are. So that if they either have to give up the desire, or they get the desire, or they don't get the desire, the consequences to the characters psychologically is extremely important and valuable. Manipulate silence and use of body language. Don't have a character narrate his own story all the way through. Even in a narrative in which it's first person, the character is telling of an experience in retrospect, there should be things the character, even in retrospect, still doesn't know and is still asking questions about. And certainly in the moment, realize that we're not omniscient, that there are things we don't know, and it's those gaps in knowledge that cost us so dearly. And you know this is true about yourself. This is why we often say, if I had only knew then what I know now. And that is one of the tragedies of human existence, is we even when we're told things in the moment we're experiencing them, we don't necessarily absorb them and process them in time to make changes. And we don't know what the consequences are going to be, because we're not fortune tellers. And even in the plays where they are, like Macbeth, a character finds out his future. To know one's future is in no way a guarantee that one can either achieve it or avoid it, or that future will be good for you. Macbeth gets exactly what he wants, and it destroys him. So make sure that, and also leave gaps in the antagonist's understanding that are very important to the outcome, and leave some gaps in your reader's knowledge, not in terms of what the reader sees, hears, tastes, or touches, but what the reader knows. Okay. Provide context that raises the emotional stakes for the main character. Give us backstory. Let us know why this isn't so important to the character. You know, the main character in 8, for example, context is everything for him. And we don't know it right away. We get this information dribbled in slowly. And that's one of the, you know, use the slow drip of information to raise the stakes. It's a really important thing to do. And that's how, one of the ways you raise the emotional stakes for the main character. But the context for this kid is, we see him at a beach at the beginning, and he's saying, my name is Jonathan. And he's saying, you know, what's wrong with this kid? First of all, why is he all by himself at the beach? He's a little young for that. And we just know something's wrong, because the kid is acting in some very strange, peculiar ways, even for a young boy. And we don't have enough information. And then he starts telling us about his father, and like, why is he telling us? Why doesn't he know anything about his father? We learn that his father died. It turns out, and he's obsessed with soccer. And it turns out that the father was at a soccer match when he died, the Hillsborough disaster, in which an entire part of the stadium collapses and kills the father. And so all of a sudden, his desire to become a soccer player makes sense. But we also understand why that him playing soccer puts his mother in so much pain. And his mother becomes, in some way, since he wants to become a soccer player and the mother doesn't want to see him playing soccer, she becomes an antagonist, but clearly is not the antagonist. Also, the damage that's been done to the mother, this kid desperately needs a healthy, functioning parent, but she can't do it. So his desperate need for a father is only compounded by the fact that he has a mother who can't be there for him right now. All of these are contextualizing stakes. So by the time we get to the scene I'm about to show you, you're really anxious. He's spending way too much time by himself. He is extremely isolated. He does not know enough. He is not parented. He is not protected. This kid's in trouble, and you worry for him. Increase or change the obstacles that are in the way of the protagonist's desires. So it's often a good idea, if a character gets past one obstacle, you put another one right in front of them. It's the old shell game of that. You'll see that oftentimes it happens in action films. It can be a little gimmicky. I wouldn't overuse this. I think what might be better in a literary terms is to make the protagonist more aware of the obstacles that were there that he or she wasn't, or they was not completely conscious of. So to make conscious an obstacle that they had not been conscious of before would be a really good way to increase tension. Finally, make your protagonist emotionally or psychologically vulnerable in a way that is recognizable to the reader. And we've already talked about that, how vulnerable this child is. So I'm going to show you this really powerful scene. I'm not going to do too much talking about it because it's pretty evident, and I don't want to just explain everything to you. I want you to experience it. And I also apologize because, as is nearly always the case, you are, the sound in this is going to be abysmal. Hopefully it'll just play. We'll see. I hate it. A little more context. At this point, he's playing. This is his friend here, he is playing on a carousel with his friend on a boardwalk next to the sea. Okay. I do apologize for the very bad subtitles because they're computer generated, so they sometimes aren't accurate. But because it's such a thick accent, it may be helpful at least a little bit to have them. Teddy says he wishes he was me, because I haven't got it, Dad. Teddy says when he gets into trouble, his dad hits him, and he doesn't get any put. That's why he wishes that. Mum's trying to find us a new dad, but for Mum it's a bit of a struggle. Don't know why. His dad's everywhere. I think Teddy talks too much. Okay. For some reason, the subtitles didn't work, but that's just fine. They're a little distracting anyway because they're so inaccurate here. But that scene doesn't seem like much right now because all you saw was a few seconds of the film. In the context of the film, this is actually a terrifying moment. Now, what I want you to think about is to watch, to take a look at that scene, to consider that scene through the eyes of a parent and think about what this character wants. This character is desperate for a father, and he's isolated and lonely, and he is totally unsupervised. He is incredibly vulnerable. And if you look at that scene, he walks up, he waits for one young boy to let go of the hand of the father that he's walking with, and then he takes the hand. And the son, this child is clearly thinks one dad is good at another. I don't understand why it's so hard for my mother to find us a new dad. There are dads everywhere. The child lets go of the father's hand. Jonathan walks up, takes the father's hands, and starts walking with him. Now, there are a lot of reasons to be terrified here. One, maybe not the most realistic, is how long will it take the father to realize this hand that he's holding is not his son? This father recognizes it immediately, but it could have taken him 100, 200 yards with his own son looking over the railing on a dock into an ocean. That whole scenario is terrifying on its own. But what's more terrifying, if you think of this moment in context, is Jonathan. Some of the things that we hope that a child has is fear of strangers. Ask yourself this question: would this kid, if a man in his 50s rolled up next to him as he was walking home from school in a car and asked him to hop in and told him he'd give him a ride, would this kid get in the car? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. So we can see just how vulnerable this child is. there are a lot of incredibly tense moments in this piece. And when you watch it, I want you to, like, one really good exercise, and this will relate to our journal assignment. One really good exercise that I want you to practice is to track the tension, the moments of tension that you see in the story as a whole, and to think about the levels of concern that you have for this child, and how the director manipulates that tension, not just with story, but with all the other elements of the story, including tone and imagery and sound, and powerfully the use of silence and body language. Okay, like I said, this is going to be a short one. My last one was very, very long. I hope this is helpful to you in thinking about your own stories and things you can do to increase the impact of the things you're writing. And look for a writing prompt for this week. This week is another week that we have both a writing prompt and a reading reaction. So those will be going up tomorrow, which will be Tuesday. And I hope this is useful to you. And I will see you all again very soon.